banking on the notion that it'll eventually turn around, right? And my brain will be used to it, will get used to it, and I will be less, and I'll be less exhausted. That's my hope.
I think it takes a while.
But I think it's going to take a while. I think it will take a while. But yeah, it's there's just a lot of new information coming into my brain, and every time that I hear a new sound, meaning a sound that I haven't really heard with the cochlear implant, it's like it really is like a new sound, like I've never heard before. So the other day, my neighbor just put in gravel, new gravel in their, and it didn't have gravel before in their driveway. And so she put gravel, and the guys are raking the gravel. Oi, that sound was just something. Yeah, it was. Whoa, that is really quite an experience. All right. So the microphone is there.
Good.
Speakers.
Question.
Now we can hear everything.
Now we can hear. All right, give me a second. Hold on.
Question.
One
Question,
second.
Rabbi.
Yeah, go ahead, Ann.
If I need to bring a book, I'm coming down.
You don't need to bring a book unless you'd like to. It's up to you.
Okay.
If you want to bring your Chumash, that would be fine. There's something about the Reform Chumash has very interesting material.
What's a Chumash?
A Chumash is the word for 5 in Hebrew is Chamesh, and a Chumash is a book with 5 sections. So a Chumash is the Torah book. So the Torah has 5 books. So a Chumash is like a book of 5. And and there's different Chumashim. Different publishers have different versions of the Torah, not of the Torah itself, right, but of the commentary attached to the Torah. And one of the very interesting ones is the Reform Movement's commentary is very interesting. And I'll tell you a little bit when Ann comes down. I'll say a little bit more
And
about
that
that.
Buddha would not be included in the 5, the commentary piece.
The commentary piece is it's a round, so to speak. Each edition is a little bit different how they manage it, but I'll show you. Whiz. I tell you. The microphone. I just dented that. I was hoping not to dent this one, but I dented it. I tell you, this is the problem, folks. With not having the lights on, it's good for the screen. It's not good for my eyes.
Or feet.
That's okay. It's already too late. All right, so I'll bring a couple of the. So when you're studying Torah, one of the things about Jewish study, right, as distinct from other forms of study, it's not the only tradition where this is the case, but you're not really supposed to study by yourself in Judaism. You're really supposed to study with another person or in a group, right? And of course, if you're alone, what are you going to do, right?
Find a partner.
Well, if you're lucky and you can find a partner, great, find a partner. If you can't, what do? You study with a Chumash or another form of the Torah that has a commentary, because then, in a sense, symbolically, you're studying with someone else, right? You're not just having your own thoughts about things. So, a traditional commentary looks like this. Where you'll see there's a little bit of the Hebrew in the middle, right? It sort of looks like a Talmud page. Actually, this is a little bit of an odd one because it has 2 different translations at the top. Here is the Hebrew, right? And then there are various commentaries around on the page. right? This is called the Commentator's Bible. In Hebrew, this would be called a Mikraot Gedolot, the big reading, right? So you don't have just one commentary, you have multiple commentaries, and very often the commentaries will disagree with one another. So Rashi says this, Rashi is a medieval commentary. A later commentary will say, well, Rashi said this, but he's wrong. And this is what it really is. And then, of course, whoever's reading gets to decide, is Rashi right or is the Ramban right? Then the Torah, the book that Anne brought down it looks like this. This is the old version of the Reformed Chumash. So you can see that this one has the Hebrew is here, right? And then there's commentary below it. The weird thing about this commentary, right, is it's great for studying because it has a little introduction to every little section. They have a little introduction, then they have the section, then they have what's called gleanings, meaning little pieces from various sources. Some of them rabbinic, some of them later modern commentaries, some of them actually sort of texts that would have been contemporary with the text of the Bible itself. And that's what's relevant to Noah's Ark, which is very, very, very interesting because it brings the Mesopotamian flood story, right? So, in case you were under the idea, right, that the flood story was unique to Hebrew culture, no, right? This is something that was very common, and so this we won't see that necessarily in this one. Certainly not in this one, right? Rashi was now talking about parallel flood stories in ancient literature, right? He didn't know about that, but this one will. And then it looks like not this little section that I happen to open to, but other sections will have little essays before the gleanings. They'll have essays about particular questions. So it's very, very good for study. It's really terrible for the synagogue because if you're reading, all of a sudden you're in the middle of a section and you've got to flip a whole bunch of pages to get to where the person is reading. It's not great for reading the Torah portion, but it's great for studying. Great for study. Actually, a later edition of this commentary brings all of the parshas together, so that if you're in a particular parsha, the Hebrew text is continuous, so you don't have to flip pages to get to the next one, which is very convenient. But for study, this is a great thing. And then the one that we tend to use today, we use here, right, and we also use it at Harvard, is this one, which is made by the conservative movement, which has the continuous text of the Torah for each portion, followed in each one by the Haftarah, right, the prophetic, the piece from the prophets that you read on a weekly basis. And that way, it's sort of everything is kind of more or less together.
Well, this has the Haftarah too.
That has the Haftarah in the back, which is
Following each book.
Following each book, right? So there's an Orthodox one that we have. I think we have one up here where all of the Haftarot are at the back of the book, right? So different. It's really not just about what is the movement that produces the Chumash. It's also what did the editor decide was the best way to manage these. The fact that we're constantly switching books, right? So if you ever go to a rabbi's table, right, you'll see 1,000 books on the table, right? Because you always need. I find myself, every once in a while, I have to. Okay, I gotta put all the books away. All right. So let's look at. We will look at the portion that we just. All right. So chapter 5 of Genesis is where we get the whole list of people, right? The whole list of everybody who lived, right? All the generations from the first person, right? Adam Harishon, right? The first person. At some point, Adam stops being a word for person and becomes a name, right? Becomes Adam, right? And so this chapter 5 runs from Adam, who lives for how many years? A lot of years.
130 got a son.
930, I think.
Lived 800 years after
Right. So he lives 130 years,
900.
right? And he has his kid. What's his kid's name?
Seth.
Seth, right? What happened to Cain and Abel? Right. So very interesting, right? That in this line, right, and this is the thing about the Torah, right? That even today we don't necessarily take this. We sort of take this into sufficient account, right? That the Torah has many different traditions, right? And so this tradition about Seth, right, as the first son of Adam, right, doesn't necessarily know about the tradition that has Cain and Abel as the first children of Adam, right? Also this tradition doesn't really know about Eve, right? So Adam and Eve, right, Adam and Chava are the parents of Cain and Avel, right? Avel, right, is very similar to the word for breath, like fleeting, the fleetingness of life, right? Because Abel doesn't last very long. He's killed by Cain, right? So this tradition, I'm about to put on the screen, but haven't yet. I apologize. This tradition, I guess I better do it the other way. Boy, sorry, everybody. Okay.
This is advanced rabbinic studies.
Every time, this is the advanced stuff that we need to do.
What's that, Naomi? I thought that Seth was the third son, and it was the children of Seth who populated the world.
Well, it is.
Except that Cain went down into Egypt where someone found him a wife, and you never
Right.
knew where the wife came from. But that's-
Exactly. I mean, it gets very complicated, right? Because you really can't. Even the Bible, right? This is the problem with a literalist, fundamentalist reading of the Bible, right? Is that even the Bible recognizes, right, that there were other people besides Cain and Abel, right? So they are the first children, right? But clearly, even in the Bible, that is symbolic because Cain needs to go off into the land of Nod, right? And God puts the mark of Cain onto Cain's forehead. Why? So that the other people won't kill him, right? Which raises a whole other kind of issue that if someone I was talking to in Roslindale the other day was very, very upset, right? That when we learn about the laws of Noah, right, it says if you spill the blood of a human, your blood will be spilled. But what about Cain? Right? Why is God so concerned with keeping Cain alive? Very
Wipe out humans from the very beginning.
right. But I mean, we all know, right, what happens with Adam and Eve? They have another child, right? So, yeah, go ahead, Naomi.
But also, in a way, God provoked Cain.
Yes,
I
Right.
mean, it was God who said, I know with your offering.
right. I don't want that. Right. And so, right.
I want blood, I want meat.
Right. All right.
Eve lived 130 years as well.
Well, that again, this is what's interesting, right? Which is that we don't know according to the Bible, right? Because this chapter 5, right? This set of traditions, right, is really only about the male line, right? So we don't hear about Chava here.
He magically made a son.
Exactly. Well, I mean, clearly there was a wife involved, but who needs to know their names, right? Right. That's extra, right?
Come a long way for you.
Yeah. Go ahead, Phyllis.
But
you know,
Not
the
long
next
enough.
line says that he begot sons and daughters, so there were lots of other sons and daughters. that we
Right.
never know about.
That's right.
Right. And I think again, like that is what is, it's really important to recognize, right? Is that the Bible, the Bible has a certain economy to it, right? So who is named in chapter 5, right? This is not always the case, right? It's very interesting. Sometimes the Bible is very, very promiscuous with names, right? It's name on top of name on top of name on top of name. Right, and those sections of the Bible, right? Torah readers often hate those sections of the Bible, right? When they're chanting in the synagogue, because there's all these names, and you have to memorize how they're pronounced because they're not words that you see on a regular basis, right? And so they're very, yeah. But here in chapter 5, the Bible is very parsimonious with the names, right? There's one name per generation, right? One name per generation, and that's it. And after you get that name, there are no other names. Everyone else is just a son and a daughter, right? All right, so I show you this, right, because and I think that there's maybe the one way of thinking about this, right, is that we have two creation myths, right, at the very beginning of Genesis, right? We have the first chapter of Genesis, right, which has this wonderful symmetrical structure, right? Where there's one day, second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day, sixth day. The first day and the fourth day are linked, and the second day and the fifth day are linked, and the third day and the sixth day are linked, and then you have the culmination in the seventh day, right? It's this wonderful, and no one dies, right? It's all about life. Everything is living all the time, right? And then we get the second creation story, right, where there's no symmetry whatsoever, right? It's all just chaos and craziness, right? And so we have that a little bit here, right? That we have here, this is part of that symmetrical sort of thing, right? We have 10 generations, and we name them, and we know how long each one of them lasted. So whenever,
Boggles the mind.
I'm sorry?
It boggles the mind to say Adam lived 930 years.
Right.
We've got some 100-some-year-old people here. You know, can you imagine?
Can you imagine?
800 and some.
Wow.
And my guess is that anybody who's made it to 100 is not looking forward to another 7 or 800 years.
You're right.
Maybe a couple more years would be good, but 700, 800 more. No, I'm done already. Please give me a break already. Right.
Not if they have to change diapers.
Right.
Mhm.
Right. And if maybe we'll get to this, right? That there's also, and so one of the things that we'll find, right, is that the Bible is also conscious of this, right? It's always very interesting to me to sort of try to imagine what counter traditions is the Bible aware of, right? And so is to what degree are there sections of the Bible that are actively sort of putting themselves into counterpoint with other parts of the Bible, and what parts of them are just two separate traditions that came down, and the people who put the Bible together, right, are putting them next to one another, right, but they're not necessarily aware of one another, right? It's a very interesting, way above my pay grade in terms of being able to say this or that or the other thing about a particular section, but I find it fascinating because I think one of the places where we have this is coming up, right? All right, so Adam lives 130 years. Oh, sorry about that. Lives 130 years, and then he has his son, right? May as well be, as far as this chapter is concerned, may as well be his only son, his first son, right? That is Seth, and then after that, he continues to have children.
It's the first son in his likeness, possibly.
It's right, and that's also, that's very nice, right? That this chapter, right? What links this chapter to chapter 1 of Genesis, as you're pointing out, Shirley, which is very important, right? Is this whole I mean, what did I do? What did I do
You
to offend
screwed
you?
up.
It's
I
a
guess
sign.
so. I guess so.
It's a
There
sign.
we go. All right, there we go. Okay, that's better. Okay. So Shirley is making a very, very important point, right? That chapter 5 begins, right, with the same kind of language that we see in chapter 1, right? We don't see that language in chapter 2, right? The second creation story doesn't talk about God creating the Adam Harishon in God's image, right? It talks instead about God making Adam from the dust, right? And breathing into him, right? The breath of life, right? This is very different, right? There is no talk of breath or of material, right? It's that God made him in the likeness of God, right? And remember, how does God create things in the first chapter of Genesis? God speaks, right? God speaks things into creation, into existence, right? God said, "Let there be light," and there was light, right? In the second book of Genesis, it's a little bit more complicated. All right, but here, right, we're back to that kind of thing, right? Creation. It doesn't say that God spoke him into being, but the language of B'Tselem Elohim, right, is very here bidmut Elohim, in the likeness of God, right? In the likeness of God. That's how it's translated. How does it translate it there?
He got a son in his likeness after his image.
Yes. Yeah.
Named him Seth.
Right. All right. So Zechar Unekeva Bara'am, right? Very important, right? For those of us who are feminists, right? That God did not create a man, right? And then later create a female, as it seems to suggest in the second book of Genesis, rather that God made men and women at the same time, right? That they are co-equal. Okay. And God blessed them, right? And called their name people, right? So here Adam is not a name. Adam is a word for person. Human, I think we would probably say today rather than man. And then, right? And then we get this business, right? And the same business, right? Bidmut Ketsalmo, right? So here's that word tselem, right? In the image of God, right? Or in the image of, so this is one way in which people are like God, according to the Torah, right? That we make new humans in our own image, right? Now, anyone, of course, who has had a child knows that you also make that child in the image of its other parent. And then you also make it maybe in the image of the various grandparents or great grandparents. And it's much more complicated than this seems to make it, to make it. But still, okay. And now none of us, thank God, as we've already discussed, live until 930 years. And, there are some big families, but I can only imagine if you keep on having kids for 800 years, it's a lot of kids. All right. So then we go through all the names, right? We go through all the names, and there's a lot of different legends about these guys, right? Especially so Methuselah, right, is a great favorite because of his name, and then Enoch, right, or Hanoch in Hebrew, is a very big puzzle for the. Go ahead, Phyllis.
It just occurred to me, nobody is talking about Eve anymore.
Right, exactly. Eve doesn't exist in this narrative, right? In this narrative, as I mentioned before, right, it's only about the person that we name the generation for. So the rabbis will talk about the generation of Noah, or the generation of Hanoch, or the generation of Seth, right? The Bible here is not concerned later, right? Everybody has brothers and sisters, or not so many sisters, but brothers, right? Here, each person is his own person, and that's all we get, right? And Eve is, and it's not that Eve doesn't matter, right? Because obviously it says here, right? There's sons and daughters, right? I mean, clearly you need females as well as men, right? Females as well as males. It's not that the women don't exist. It's that the only thing that matters in this particular chapter is the father of the generation, right? The first son of the first son of the first son of the first son. That's all we really care about here. But the thing to remember, right, is that the Bible is not consistent about this. In this chapter, that's what really matters. In other chapters, other things matter. So Hanoch is always an interesting one, right? Because he only lives about half, right? And he doesn't die, right? It never says about Hanoch that he dies, right? He walks with God. What did God do? God took him. What does that exactly mean? The Bible is silent, right? So you can imagine the rabbis had a great time coming up with stuff about this.
That's very interesting. He, walked with God, then he was no more,
Right,
or God took him.
right.
What's the difference between that and death?
In Hebrew, why is that sama in kind of a parentheses?
That means that there is a break. There's a break. If you were to be looking at a Torah scroll, you would see a break between that word and the next word.
Oh.
So most of the Torah, like big swaths of the Torah, is just a continuous column. There are several places. Also, there are many places in the Torah where there's a lot of breaks. This is one of the places where there's a lot of breaks. And some of those breaks are within a line, meaning that it ends at the beginning of a line and then picks up at the end of a line, and there's a blank space in the line in the middle of, sort of like imagine what do they call it? A justified, I think it's called, right, in printing, when it's justified on both sides, right, and you end up sometimes with weird lines. So sometimes it's like that, and sometimes it's like, okay, this is the end of the line, and then the next line starts on the next. The next line is where the text picks up again. We can look in the Torah scroll later, right?
Computers do that a lot too.
I'm sorry.
Computers.
Right. And this is all traditional, right? Where how the text was first written down and what came down to us. Okay, so so Florence, your question is a good one. What's the difference? What is it? I don't know. It's a good question, right? So those are the kinds of questions, right, that the rabbis will ask, and they'll find answers for. Off the top of my head, I don't have those answers in my head. That's one of the things that's one of the reasons that we don't study by ourselves, right? Because we don't want to, it's not so much that we don't want to be left with questions, it's that we want to be able to have a response to the questions. We want to be able to argue about what they mean, right? We don't want to just say, oh, I wonder what that means. I don't know.
Well, then how is it described if somebody died and this language is different?
Yes. So the way here, this is the word for died. Vayamot. He died, right? And with Enoch, as Anne already pointed out, right? The enenu, he was no more, right? So is that also death? Does that mean he was bad? Meaning that he died, by unnatural causes early in his life, right?
365 days, that's early.
Well, right. Well, if it's early, if your father lived until be 950, then yeah, 365 is young. All right. So let's see what the Chumash tells us about Hanoch. All right. So he's singled out for special mention. The brevity of this biographic note suggests the one-time existence of some well-known story connected with his life and death. In post-biblical Jewish literature, Hanoch was the focus of legends connecting him with the knowledge of the secrets of heaven, right? With the invention of mathematics and astronomy, and especially with the devising of the solar-based calendar.
Are you talking about email, Pam?
Yeah,
Oh, wait a
Right.
minute.
What a smart
You
cookie.
know, all these numbers for years, their year may have been totally different.
right. Right. It could have been a different year. I mean, rabbinic tradition treats them as years, right? Like regular years, like
Yeah.
our years.
What-
But it's quite possible that the Torah had a different way of counting,
They use
Yeah.
a month.
right? Yeah. So right. So that's always there's this sort of trick of reading the Bible, right? On one hand, you want to read it literally, right? Because there's sort of a magic in reading it literally. And at the same time, you don't want to read it literally because you're really limiting yourself if you're reading it literally. So you kind of have to do both at the same time, right? So the
Is
regular
that
form.
possible?
Why not, Sandy?
How can you read two different things at the same time? Either
I
it's
mean,
one or the other.
A lot of being human, Sandy, I would argue, a lot of being human is about the capacity to hold two contradictory truths in your head at one time.
Absolutely.
And one of the things, I always think of, I tend to be a little bit of a functionalist, like, why do we do the things we do? Right. One of the reasons I think that people are religious, right, that one of the reasons we have religion is that it's one of the ways that helps us understand that we need to hold multiple truths in our head at the same time. And that religion becomes very much less helpful when it insists that there's only one truth. But that's just me. All right, so it says here, the regular formula "he lived" is replaced by a description of how he lived. Right, he walked with God. This idiom used again only of Noah, right, which is interesting, right? Describes a life in closest intimacy with God. This is what the Chumash says, right? So somehow, right, he was taken early, right, which might suggest that he did something wrong, right? That he wasn't like somehow he was, he died early because why do people die early? Because they do something wrong, right? We know that that's not the case in real life, but sometimes it's sort of, it's established that way. Right. So I think most of the important, what it says here is the text is deliberately obscure
Because why we don't know.
because we don't know why.
It's like Mama saying because I said so.
I mean, in a certain sense, there is a little bit, but the way that it's not like Mama saying I said so, right, is that it invites the reader, right, to imagine, well, what does this mean, right?
Well, they had alternate realities in those days too, then, right?
Of course, we all have different ways, right? We have different ways of understanding different, of different phenomena, right? And so some commentators, it says here, see in Hanoch as a saint, right? He was a saint, and why would God take him early? Because he was a saint. God took him to keep him from being corrupted by his wicked counterparts. Others see him as morally deficient, right? He walked with God, but he would not deign to be involved in the concerns of his less pious neighbors.
No,
Right.
we don't know that.
But we don't know anything, Florence. We know nothing, right? So that's sort of the, on one hand, people complain about Midrash, right, because it's so fanciful. On the other hand, right, it's really building sandcastles in the air, right? Because we really don't, there's not a lot to base it on. There's just little hints, right? And so people take the hints and they make the lesson they want to make,
They run with it.
right? And usually you can tell, that the people who are, they're wanting to say, okay, well, that little argument, is Hanoch a saint who needs to be protected from the people around him? Or is he someone who was, okay, he was more pious than the rest of them, but he was not really engaged in the world in a helpful way? And so God, said, okay, well, I tried to make you be a prophet, but you're not going to do it, so I'm just taking you away. right? That's very much like the story of Noah, right? Which hopefully we'll get to, but it looks like we got into chapter 5 and we're not going to get into chapter 6, but we'll see. All right. So let's go now to Lamech, right? So Lamech lived 182 years and he got a son, right? This is already different, right? This is different because everyone else begets a person with a name, right? Lamech begets a son. Right? So already we know that there's something different going on, right? And he named him,
Noah.
right? He named him Noah. Why does he name him Noah? Right? We get an explanation of the name. All the other names just come, right? But here we get an explanation. This one will provide us relief. Noah, right? Comfort. Right? Noah will be a comforter. Right? And then later on, Noah's wife will be known to the rabbis as Nama, which is like the pleasant one, right? And Noah, as we know, is the person who takes care of all the animals, right? And then he becomes he plants vineyards, right? And he's the first drunk, right, that we hear about, right? And Nama is, in the rabbis say that Nama was the one who took care of the seeds, right? So that because so much of the creation story, right, is concerned with plants, right? And we don't get any plants here. And in the Noah story, right, it's very little to do with the plants, right? It's all about the animals, right? But the first 2 books of Genesis are very concerned with plants, right? So the rabbis are like, what about the plants? Well, clearly that was what Nama did, right? Nama was the one who kept all the seeds and replanted the earth when after it was destroyed. Right? Okay. All right.
There's a boggling sentence here.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
When Noah had lived 500 years, he begat Shem, Ham, and Japheth.
Right. So
Men began to increase on earth, and daughters were born to them.
there we go. What happened?
The divine beings saw how beautiful the daughters of men were, and they took their wives from among those that pleased them.
And the
The
Lord, right.
divine beings were something else.
Yes, there we go, right? V'nei ha-Elohim. What is that Chumash said in the V'nei ha-Elohim?
Well, I don't know where Elohim is.
Let me see if I can find it.
I can find it in English.
What page are you on there, Ann?
I'm on page 52 and 53.
All right, but this is a very interesting verse, right? Not one that you necessarily would have heard from in most discourse about the Bible. Why might that be?
Difficult to explain.
Difficult to explain, a little embarrassing, right? So I think this is like, again, sort of a time-honored tradition in reading the Bible, right? Where there's a difficult verse, something that we don't really like to, we don't either want to grapple with or we don't really want to have to deal with, right? We just kind of don't talk that much about it, right? We don't get rid of it. We don't make a bigger deal of it by trying to excise it and have a fight about whether it should be there or not. We just sort of acknowledge, okay, that was then, right? That was then, this is now. We don't really think about divine beings in the same way that maybe they did back in the day. I might be online. I think it might have been Doty's.
It implies that there are a lot of surplus women, because they only apply among those that please them. This implies that there are some that do not please them.
Why don't you mute everybody?
But it doesn't even say that the men took them as wives. It said the divine beings.
Yeah, where
saw
are
how
these
beautiful
divine
the
beings
daughters of
suddenly?
men were.
Right. This is a great question. So the rabbis generally will not cop to the idea that there were actually divine beings that would come down from heaven, right? They said instead, right, they would say that, well, the word Elohim can mean God, but the word, or gods, right, it's a plural, right, but it also can mean judges. And so these are the sons of the judges, right? That these are the sons of the great men, right? And it is a sign, right, of sort of the corruption of humanity, right? That the great people, right? The judges. I mean, we have a little bit of that today, right? Where people we have a lot. We seem to be losing a lot of faith in some of our political leaders, right? Because of their behavior, right? That when people in positions of power behave badly, right, that leads to corruption of the entire society and community. So that's how the rabbis will deal with this, right? Probably literally, it probably meant something along the lines of what we're familiar with from other cultures, right? Where other cultures that were more comfortable with the idea of multiple gods, first of all, and also the connection, the sexual connection between divine beings and humans, right? We have the example of the Greek myths, right? There's a lot of that in Greek myth, right? That is not, it's in Greek myth, obviously, it's not the only place where we see that. That's a very common human idea. Go ahead.
What about the divine conception of Mary?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Right. I mean, because Christianity obviously, takes very, very clearly, right, from Greek myth, right, of the God who is, born in the spring and dies in the fall and so on and so forth, right? It's the death and resurrection that comes from Greek mythology and mystery religions, right? So already Christianity is merging, right? But it was already merged, right? In a certain sense, it was just that in Judaism, right, especially in rabbinic Judaism, but probably even a little bit more so in pre-rabbinic Judaism, right? There was an effort to get rid of that sort of what they would describe as paganism, right? But the issue is when you have sacred texts are sacred, right? The text is sacred. You don't just get rid of it because it doesn't. So if this is a tradition that came down and was really important, right? You're not just gonna erase it. You have to somehow deal with it, right? So how do they deal with it? This one they deal with by saying it was the judges, who are having affairs. Here, this is not surprising to me, right? This Chumash talks about all the mythological aspects of it, right? Because this is the Reform Chumash is much more comfortable bringing that in. This one, the one from the conservative movement, says no Jewish authority acknowledges the existence of divine beings that come down and have babies with human. All right. So what does God say? Very interesting. This is one of those places I was saying before where the text seems to be aware, right, of countertexts. And so the Lord says, what does God say? My breath shall not abide in man forever because he is flesh, right? Just like animals, he is flesh, right? So he shouldn't live forever the way these guys are living forever. So what is going to be the lifespan of a person?
100.
May of Esrim, right? If you're Jewish, you've heard this, right? May you live until 120. I mean, anyone who really wants to live to 120, let them, God be with them, right? It's a lot of years, but, right? Who lived to 120 according to the Torah? Moses. Right, Moses lives to 120, and his eyesight is not dimmed. He didn't even have cataract surgery, but his eyesight is not dimmed, and his muscles are still strong, right, until the day he dies, right. So that's the way you want to live to 120, right? 120 without any of the less appealing aspects of aging. I actually just read today that because of cataract surgery, actually that people who have had cataract surgery often find themselves sleeping better because their brains are able to process light and darkness more clearly. And so their circadian clock is sort of reinvigorated by the fact that light reaches their brains.
It is interesting.
It is, which is fascinating. I'm thinking about cataract surgery because my parents have both just had it recently, and they both see so much better now, and it really makes a difference. All right, so 120 years. That's how long people are going to live, right? And so that seems to be, in some ways, a little bit in reaction to all these crazy lifespans, right? But but Noah is still going to live a crazy life.
Yeah.
Right? He's going to live forever. Right? The one who sort of breaks the trend a little bit is Abraham. He still lives a really, really long time by our standards, but not in the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, right? Under 200 years. All right. And then here's another crazy verse, right? That the tradition really doesn't know what to do with. Oh, God, sorry. That the tradition really doesn't know what to do with, right? That the Nephilim, right? We don't know what to do with it so much that we don't even have a word for it. All we can do is transliterate it, right?
So we don't know what that means.
Not really. They were on the earth, right? And that was when the B'nai Elohim, right? That was when the B'nai Elohim were cohabiting with. So that was when the judges, right? Remember, they're judges. They're not gods, right? They're not gods or demigods. They're just people, right? And who bore them offspring. They were the heroes of old, right? Hagiborim, right?
Rashi had a theory,
Yes.
footnote 4, that they were the Nafal, the fallen one.
Yes. Right.
Wait a minute. The last sentence, they were the heroes of old. Who
Yeah,
does
who's the
they
they?
refer to?
Yeah.
The Nephilim.
What made them heroes?
Again, like the problem with this translation, right, is the word Gibor doesn't really mean hero. It means sort of really super duper strong one. Like Shimshon in the Bible, Samson is described as a Gibor, right? So is he a hero in the way that we think of like superheroes, right? Or is he just like a really big, strong guy?
Well, renowned.
But of renown, right? So I mean, sort of think about like when you read the Iliad, right, or the Odyssey, right? That the Homer, the poet we call Homer, right? This is basically describing these ancient guys, right, who are so much bigger and stronger and more powerful and more heroic than anyone who's alive today, right? It's along those lines, right? The thing is that there's, the Bible is full of fragments, right? So the Nephilim will come back, right? The Nephilim, they show up when the spies go into the land of Canaan in the book of Numbers, right? Moses sends the spies to check out what's going on there. The spies come back and say, oh my God, there are Nephilim there, right? And they are huge, right? So eventually, that's why we have the tradition that the Nephilim were giants, right?
Sounds like they cohabitated with the daughters of men, who bore them offspring.
Right. Well, that's what it says. That's what it says in the Bible. And of course, Jewish tradition is not comfortable with that, but it's in there. So we got to, just like there's lots of things we're not comfortable with in the Bible, right? The rabbis had lots of things they weren't comfortable with either, right? It's, this is the issue with having a sacred text, right? Is that there are things that are inconvenient for our systems.
When Shir Tekva, my congregation,
Yeah.
was doing it Siddur, they used the Hebrew from the conservative thing that's in your book. Anyway, there were certain things that didn't translate well. So they left them there in Hebrew, but they wrote something else in Hebrew.
That's very common. That is very, very common. And to be honest, that's so common, right? It happens a lot in non-liturgical settings, right? Sometimes translations that you read of, say, Dostoevsky, right, or of of Homer, right? Of any kind of literature that's in a different language, whenever a translator runs into something that is either just over his head, right, or perhaps might be seen as being offensive in the target language, right? What do? Do you translate it literally? No, right? You make something up, right? Because you don't want to offend the people who are reading your translation, or you don't have really any idea what it means, so you just make some stuff up. Because what else you gotta finish the job, right? You gotta translate it, so you gotta write something, right? It might not be right, but it's something, and you get paid.
You gotta be careful with these people, say, I believe every cross T and dotted I, it's important.
Right. I mean,
You
and
have to be a little flexible.
right, and this is one of the very interesting things about the Jewish approach to reading the Bible, as opposed to a more typical Christian approach, and I think probably a Christian approach in probably most countries, but certainly in this country, right, is that in Christianity, the Bible that you read is the Bible, right? Whereas here, the Bible is what's written in Hebrew, and the translation is the translation, right? And we can always argue about the translation, right? Sometimes the argument is worth having, other times the argument's not worth having, right? But there's much more room, right, for having a conversation about what something means, right? As soon as there's a translation and that's what it means, very often the conversation is finished. All right, so the Nephilim, if I had the book, I think the book is in my car, unfortunately, so I won't be able to read it to you. But there's a whole list of things that the rabbis said, okay, well, the various sorts of giants, right? And they go through all the giants, and the Giborim, right, are one kind of giant, the Nephilim or the Anakim or another giant, and the Azim or another giant. They're all different kinds of giants that happen in the Bible. Right, and the rabbis want to basically say, well, these all giants sort of fall into one category of giants, right? And so, and again, so on one hand, right, the rabbis are like, no, there's no divine beings, right? It's just judges. On the other hand, the rabbis are like, yeah, there's all kinds of giants. Right, so you got to go. Great to see you. All right, so. And the Lord saw how great was man's wickedness on earth, right? Ki rabba ra'ata adam ba'aretz, right? And kol yetzer machshavot libo rak ra kol hayom, right? And that the inclination, right? The yetzer, the inclination, or here it's translated as the plan, right? Machshavot is the word for thoughts, right? And libo is heart, right? But in Hebrew, in biblical Hebrew, right, the heart is what we would call the head, right? It's sort of the heart and the head together, right? It's the seat of emotion and thought, right? So later we'll see God's heart is saddened in the next verse. Right, it's the same word in Hebrew, right? Because the seat of emotion and the seat of rationality is the same in Hebrew, right? It's lev, right?
What is the word?
Lev. So here it is, the one I'm circling up here. Libo is his heart, talking about the heart of people, right? The heart of a human, the machshavot libo, the thoughts of a person's heart are, according to God here, are only evil, kol hayom, every day, right? That's what God. So, which also leads to all kinds of questions about the nature of God, right? Wait, didn't God create humanity in God's image, right? So, is God is all good and people are all bad? But wait, if there's badness in humans, right, then that must mean that there must be something not great in God. It gets very complicated, right? And And then what does God say? Vayinachem, right? And this is a play on the word on Noah's name, right? Nach here. That God sort of regrets, right, that he made the person on earth, right? Vayit atzev el libo, and his heart was saddened, right? That God is sad because things didn't turn out the way God wanted them to turn out. And so what is God going to do?
So does that mean he made man with goodwill, with free will?
Well, right. I mean, so we're sort of getting here, right, to sort of one way of understanding good and evil, right, in the world, right, that the Bible is getting to this right here in this weird section, right, which a lot of people don't read or they skip over really quickly, right, because of the whole business of the Nephilim and the B'nai HaElohim. Like, we don't want to think about this, right? But here, this notion, right, that God, how did God create people, right? God, I mean, it's very clear from the story of Cain and Abel, right, that people make their own decisions. I'm sorry?
That there is evil.
And that there is evil, right? And what is God's potential intervention, right? The only thing God can seem to be able to manage to do, right, is to destroy everything. So I think it's a very interesting way of looking at what we might call theodicy, right? The idea, the explanation for why does evil exist and why doesn't God do something, right, to stop the evil in the world, right? And one of the answers that obviously there's different answers in different parts of the Bible, but the answer here appears to be because what does God say? I will blot out from the earth the men whom I created, men together with beasts, creeping things and birds of the sky, for I regret that I made them.
He pushed delete.
Right. That's all. And that seems to be delete. He pushed delete. Right. I wrote it. I'm going to put it in the trash, and that's it. Right. Yeah.
But the plants aren't included.
No, the plants aren't included, and neither is the fish. Right. But it's very interesting, right? That it seems that even though God, on one hand, is the creator God, right, and seems to have sort of ultimate power, on the other hand, the only option that God seems to have here, right, is this all or nothing, right? Either I keep people with all of their bad stuff, and who knows, it's hard for me to imagine that people were all evil, but that was all that God could see, right? And I have to keep everybody alive with all this bad stuff, or what's my other option?
Knock 'em off.
Just let it be. Like I can get rid of it all, or I can keep it all, right? And God, what does God eventually decide? Right? God decide. Okay, well, Noah. I have Noah, right? I have Noah, and I'm going to keep one of everything. I'll keep Noah and Noah's wife, Noah's kids, right? Their wives, and examples of each kind of land-based creature, right? I'll keep one of each alive, and we'll sort of start over, right? But that's kind of a drastic solution, right? And it's one that God says later on, right? Every time we see a rainbow, right, we're supposed to say a blessing, remembering the covenant that God made with Noah, right? This rainbow is a covenant, there's a mark of my covenant with you that I will never destroy the world with water again, right? And so in a sense, right, it's sort of recognized, well, God has, in a sense, tied God's hands, right? That is, I'm not going to destroy the entire world again, so I have to sort of let people be who they are, which is rak ra kol hayom, and they're going to be only evil all day, which of course we hope that we're not going to be, right? And then it's also interesting. One of the other things that God does do, right, in the wake of Noah, right, is that God introduces what are called the Noahide laws, right? So that there are sort of basic rules of society, right, that that people need to follow in order to be part of the covenant of general humanity. Right? And one of them is we don't murder each other. And the other thing that God does is God, according to the Bible, right, everybody was vegetarian, right? So maybe one of the things that people were doing that was evil, right, was eating animals, right? And so God, after the flood, God says to Noah that people can eat animals. I don't know. Yeah, go ahead.
Go back to the other version with Cain and Abel.
Yes,
God wanted the meat.
right. That's what, right. But not for humans to eat. That was for God to eat,
Okay.
or not to eat necessarily, right? But of course, why would you be raising animals if it weren't for food? Right? But again, these things are different traditions of the Bible are work on so in the rabbinic conception of things, it's the one which is the one I'm reciting to you now, right? The rabbis decide that everyone was vegetarian until Noah, right? Cain and Abel is a problem for that rabbinic idea, right? So that has to be in a parallel way. But you're right. You're absolutely right. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jody. It looks like did we lose Sandy?
Right, good to be with you.
It's great to be with you. So I'm so glad you joined us.
I will be seeing you more and more, I guess.
I hope so.
But
That'd be great. Thank you, Judy. See you soon.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye, everybody.
It's a mystery.
What's a mystery? Life.